Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Ian Lustick, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of several books, including Unsettled States, Disputed Lands, and For the Land and the Lord, Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel. Ian, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
I should say welcome back to Berkeley.
It's a pleasure to be back.
Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in Syracuse, New York, upstate New York, but I was raised in what you have to call northern New York, which is 70 miles north of Syracuse, near Canada, in a kind of hump at the top of New York State, a small town of about 30,000 people, which is the largest city in a radius of 70 miles. So it's not what people normally think of as New York.
And what was that city?
Watertown, Watertown, New York.
New York. And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your character?
Well, it was we had a very close family. There are 5 siblings. My parents left Syracuse to build a home in Watertown because they wanted to get out of the rat race of Syracuse, which is kind of interesting in itself. My grandfather on one side was a farmer, very unusual for a Jew to be a farmer in upstate New York. I remember driving up in the farm truck, actually, to move into Watertown. It was an adventure for my parents. They wanted to be close enough to the family to maintain the ties, but far enough away to be independent, start their own. My father's a pediatrician, first Jewish pediatrician in Watertown, and a small Jewish population with a small synagogue. I think in our home we were very much inculcated with the notion that the most important things in life were family and service to others, and the idea was to find an occupation that you loved and that would actually be a good thing to do. And actually the siblings all went into the various professions. As it happened, none of us did go into business, but a number of us went into medicine. I'm the only one so far who's an academic, but it looks like my youngest brother may well follow in that direction.
So were there a lot of books around the house, I guess? A lot of intellectual discussion about world affairs?
Well, we used to argue a lot at the dinner table about a lot of things, and this was unusual in Watertown, and I know that I remember, though, when it comes to even the Middle East would come up a lot. It was a Zionist household, not a very politicized household. My parents didn't come from backgrounds of engaged left-wing Jewish intellectuals. These were working families, lower middle class, farmer, insurance salesman, very glad not to be in Europe and very anxious to meld into American society. But we as a family were quite intensively interested in arguing about political matters. My mother and father remember them always reading Walter Lippmann and talking about, if there was something going on with the Vietnam War, for example, well, what is Lippmann saying about this? That was an important idea to me, that you could follow certain people who really knew were better informed than you, articulate, and it was a long time before I was ready to read the editorial pages, but I was very interested in talking to them and arguing it. When I would write a paper in school, my father and I would always talk about it.
Do you remember any books from your youth that sort of really had an impact on you?
J.D. Salinger, Catcher in the Rye, the idea that the world is not as it's purported to be, the phoniness around me, which so many young people experience. I used to be fascinated by the idea that if this were true, that actually the world is not the way people try to make it look. And then I'd look around at my little Jewish community in the synagogue where 100 people would come together for a bar mitzvah, and everyone would appear to be a certain way, and there's a contradiction here. I can't imagine that, this person, Maury Shuffler, isn't what he says he is. And yet, according to what I've just been reading and feeling, somehow these people shouldn't be an exception. So how do you live in a world when when you can't challenge everything that's happening, and yet somehow you know that what you're seeing is not what's actually there. And I remember that as a very important, intriguing set of problems for me early on.
And so where did you go to college?
Well, growing up in Watertown, I never had a Jewish teacher. And being Jewish was very important. I was an Orthodox rabbis. I got a pretty good Jewish education. It was almost like living in a shtetl. And I say this because, and there was quite a bit of anti-Semitism. I mean, I was chased and beaten up a couple times for killing, you killed our God kind of thing when I was a kid. I wanted to see what Jews were like. I didn't really think I knew. So I went to Brandeis. It wasn't a choice that my parents or my father was fully enthusiastic about, precisely because, well, why don't you, you're a smart kid, you can go to a non-Jewish, but I wanted to go and see. And it was a wonderful place because in the 60s, it was late 60s, I went there in 67, very political, very intense intellectually, very high quality students, partly because these were students who weren't being allowed in under quotas to the Ivy League schools. And so I grew up in the midst in Brandeis of the anti-war movement. The Cambodia student strike was headquartered at Brandeis. The first building takeover by black students took place at Brandeis when I was there, the Ford Hall takeover. So it was a very exciting place to be.
And how, beyond what you've just said, did that experience, that revolutionary air of the 60s affect you long term? It
affected me long term. I mean, I grew up with this love of the country that permeated Jews who were the children of immigrants. All my grandparents were basically immigrants. And here was, and the other thing that dominated my thinking and came out of the family was the Holocaust. So such a huge proportion of my family's relatives were killed and never heard from again after the Holocaust. And that was an overwhelming experience. Whatever I was going to do, it was going to be learned the lessons of that, which in my mind meant you had to actually act in the world to be vigilant against injustice. And that was a commitment that came out of Watertown and came right into the anti-war movement. So at first, when I thought in Watertown, like everyone else, we were fighting a just war to stop, not to commit the act of appeasement again in Southeast Asia. And it was a wrenching experience to try to look at it the other way. I had one uncle who would come up and argue with us and say, the Vietnam War is not what you think it was in 65, 66. And my parents and I had the same reaction. But wait a minute, aren't we doing what we should have done to protect Czechoslovakia? When I got to Brandeis, within 3 weeks, I remember one conversation, of how would you feel? You're a peasant in South Vietnam, and all these arguments don't make any sense. The march on the Pentagon occurred, and I realized, learned very quickly, my God, all what I've been thinking of trying to do, to be vigilant about injustice, it's on the other side of the fence. And for a year, visits home were dominated by arguments with my family, my parents. Nothing could be said in the house until they accepted an anti-war position, which they did. And the whole family became almost ostracized in Watertown because of that. And that was a difficult thing. Even within the Jewish community, my parents were willing to argue against the war. Only 20 years later did they get apologies from some of their friends about the way they were treated.
So you do your undergraduate work at Brandeis, then you come to Berkeley, and somewhere in this path, you get interested in the Middle East. Tell us about that.
Well, part of being interested in the Holocaust was also being interested in Israel. So when I was growing up, I was fascinated by Israel. I remember during the Six-Day War, which was my senior year in high school, I was raising money for an emergency relief fund. When I got to Brandeis and I started becoming active in the anti-war movement, I encountered a new left attacks on Israel, Palestinian attacks on Israel, which I'd only heard echoes of earlier. Never really knew much about the Palestinians. It made me extremely nervous when I would realize that I was in a conversation with somebody about Israel and I didn't know as much as they did. So I went and started studying more so that I would always know more about this issue than anybody I was arguing about. And then when I was starting to learn more about it, I realized that I was wrong to think that of all the problems in the world that were gray and complicated and had more than one side, that I was so fortunate that my issue that I cared most about, the Israel-Palestine question, There was black and white, and I didn't have to worry about complexities. I literally remember being amazed at how lucky I was. I went to Israel in 1969 for 6 months in the Jacob Hyatt program, and I studied the Palestinian question. I wrote a paper, my first published paper actually, on what do the Palestinians really want in the West Bank. I argued even at that time they wanted ultimately a West Bank Gaza state alongside of Israel, even though the PLO wasn't saying it yet. And what I learned about Israel at the time convinced me that, again, to be vigilant against injustice, to save Jews from another catastrophe, meant actually working for peace between Israelis and Palestinians and getting Israelis and Jews to see that this was not a black and white situation. It was much more difficult. And I was shocked in '69 to find Jews talking about settling in the West Bank in order to bring the Messiah. And it baffled me to think that Jews wouldn't be able to clearly see how disastrous this was. That started a lifelong commitment to study this problem and try to contribute to its solution.
We'll come back to this issue in a minute, but let's talk about this decision to become a political scientist and actually somebody who does comparative politics. Help me understand what it takes to do what you do and what it is you do.
Well, I mean, I do study comparative politics, but I also try to reach people. I try to reach people and teach them things that they don't want to learn. And one of the things I found when I lecture about Arab-Israeli relations or Palestinian question, Jewish audiences, mixed audiences, is that if you start right out with your position on the issue, you're not going to reach people. One of the best ways I have found to reach people is to puzzle them. Give them a question about the world that is not apparently political in the sense that it doesn't look like it's slanted toward or against their prejudice. How do you explain this? Isn't this odd? And get them to focus on that as an analytic question, which they want to solve. Mm-hmm. And then in the presentation show them that in order to get rid of the anxiety that this question causes, they have to learn a theoretical framework. They have to learn something about the way the world works. And they also have to abandon a prejudice that they had. But they don't realize that until later in the presentation, when they've already learned what they needed to do to solve the initial question. Now, this whole operation is science, is figuring out, when it was no more clearly represented to me than in my studies at Berkeley in the political science department with faculty like Ernst Haas and Ken Waltz and Bob Price. First, know the question you want to answer. What is the puzzle you want to solve? And then solve it. Now, when it's a general question, and it's not a factual question about a historical episode, you can't solve it without looking comparatively at more than one case. In the natural sciences, we can all often set up experiments artificially in a laboratory. But what is an experiment but a comparison between a control group and a treated group? The chemicals that are set and not disturbed, the chemicals that are heated. And then you compare. In our world of human societies, we can't recapitulate France again and again. So we have to look for what are called natural experiments. Countries which, for example, which are similar in many, many respects, but different in some crucial respect, so you can learn about what difference that makes.
And in sort of implementing this strategy, one of your major books is Unsettled States, Disputed Lands. And you told us that you had this fascination with Israel and with the Middle East. But in that book, you said about comparing the situation of the Israeli leadership and the disputed lands, in a dispute with Palestine, with other case studies. Tell us a little about that choice and what you learned.
Right. Well, I knew that in order to convince the people I needed to convince, both the Jewish community in the United States, Israelis, and the American government, that the settlement policy in the West Bank and Gaza, I thought this back in the early 70s, was a catastrophe. Even though there were only a few hundred settlers, I wrote and argued that before long there would be tens of thousands and then 100,000, and it would tend to prevent a solution to the problem that was otherwise available. But I knew that if I just argued about that, I wouldn't be able to succeed. I needed to be able to anchor my arguments in other cases. That meant looking for me at France and Algeria, Britain, and Ireland. Why? Well, when I went, in 1979, I entered the State Department for a year in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and I was charged with analyzing Israeli-Palestinian relations and actually contributing to autonomy negotiations. And at that time, I realized that you could only say a limited amount by staring at the Israeli-Palestinian case and just looking at it, piling up facts about it. There was an argument going on. Were the settlements, so many settlements, had they prevented any possibility of Israel withdrawing from the West Bank? Had the point of no return been passed? If it had been passed, then arguing for a Palestinian state would be a stupid policy by the United States, because we would just be playing into aggrandizement on Israel's part with no rights to the Palestinians. We should shift to argue for one democratic state. But if it was still possible for Israel to withdraw, because the settlements themselves couldn't stop a state from emerging, then U.S. policy of trying to stop the settlements was still valid. How would you know whether the point of no return had been passed? Israelis, smart Israelis who knew everything about what was going on the ground, some of them said, my God, 50,000 settlers, impossible to ever change. 50,000 settlers, easy to change. You're insane. No, you're insane. How was I to know? And it was my responsibility, as it were, to advise the U.S. government. So at that time I realized that I needed a theory of how states arise and get smaller, because this was really a claim of the conditions under which any state can get smaller. Israel could get out of the West Bank. But there is no theory. So I had to actually knew that eventually I'd have to write a book which would develop a theory of state contraction. And that theory couldn't only be based on the Israel-Palestine case, or else the whole theory would be loaded from the beginning. I had to base it on other cases. And I used the British relationship with Ireland over time, where a parliamentary democracy had annexed Ireland, then eventually withdrawn from most of it, and the French relationship with Algeria, in which Algeria was officially made a province of France, only eventually to be withdrawn from completely. How did this happen? What theory could explain the irregularities in this long process? And what would the theory look like if you applied it to Israel-Palestine? To accomplish that objective took 3 books and about 15 years. And
what was the conclusion that you came to?
The operative conclusion that I came to, I put in the conclusion of the book in 1993, which was published in 1993, and that is that actually there will be a Palestinian state. Israel did not pass the point of no return, because in order to do so, the issue of what to do with the West Bank and Gaza had to disappear from the Israeli political imagination. And for reasons that my theory led me to, I argued that this was not done in Israel and could not be done. At the same time, I argued that in order to create that solution, there was another terribly difficult political problem that had to be solved, which is to negotiate a regime crisis. I argued that in order for Israel to do what ultimately it would do, namely get out of the West Bank and Gaza, it would have to tolerate a serious threat of civil war. So that one of the specific things I said in my conclusion was that eventually, and probably pretty soon, there will be a secret deal between the PLO and a government in Israel to move toward negotiations. This was before Oslo. But that the prime minister who tries to carry out that deal will be subject to assassination attempts, especially by Jewish fundamentalists. But that I argued that a crafty government could do what Churchill had done in Ireland, tried to do, and what de Gaulle did, which is to use the extremism of the opponents against them, and to shift the whole meaning of the dispute into a question of defending democracy in Israel. This, and I argued in the Israeli press, this is what the government should do. It should, in a jujitsu way, use the extremism of their opponents to move swiftly toward the implementation of Oslo. They did not follow my advice, and we see the consequences now. Eventually that will be done, is my view. But I think it illustrates very well that you cannot make the kind of contribution to policy and to really a moral commitment without systematic, scientifically organized investigation of history and politics. And that's what I've been trying to do, really, all my professional career.
We should bring a little history in, and I know that you feel history is important in your work. And I'm reminded what you said about your youth and sort of figuring out, well, what is the truth here and what isn't, is what we know, what we think we know. And in your book on the fundamentalists in Israel, you really point out that the Six-Day War was really both a curse for Israel and a blessing, so that the victory really created a situation which changed the internal dynamic in Israel.
Yes.
And that is very important. Explain that for us, the way that a dynamic was set in place.
Right. Every political system that works, including the United States, works because some questions are not being asked. If every day the United States had to ask, should we really be a monarchy after all? I mean, maybe just because we had our revolution in 1776, we still ought to think about it. There are an infinite number of questions that you could ask. And certain groups in the society, for example, now that we've ruled out slavery and racism as a politically acceptable official ideology, there are many, many groups in this country that otherwise would have power that can't even compete effectively. It's a great thing for a country to be able to exclude a certain number of political formulas so that it can proceed down one path somewhat coherently. One of the achievements of Israel in its early days, in the 50s and 60s, was to exclude some of the most popular Zionist images of what the country really should be. Images that it should be God's kingdom on earth, that it should be a large country, including all the land of Israel. The most potent critiques of the Ben-Gurion Mapai leadership came from those groups. So when Ben-Gurion celebrated a state whose borders were weird and excluded, actually, the biblically most important parts of the country for Jews, and emphasized the state of Israel, not the land of Israel, he was making it possible to forget about a lot of dreams of expansion that could only get Israel into trouble. At the same time, of course, it ensured the dominance of his party and excluded his main rivals. What happened in the 1967 war, which in part came about because of Ben-Gurion's own ruthless use and Dayan's ruthless attitudes toward the Arabs in the 50s and 60s, and so it contributed to a climate by the 60s of another round, another attempt by the Arab states to destroy Israel, was that the victory, the military tactical victory, opened up what had been termed the fantasies of the Israeli right and the activist labor rights, that really Zionism should rule all the land of Israel, that was an illegitimate state just in these confines of what were called the Green Line, the 1949 armistice lines. We should not look at the West Bank as stony hills and enemy territory, as Ben-Gurion said. It's Judea and Samaria. We are redeeming it. We are liberating it. So all of those elites that had effectively been excluded from political competition, all of those ideological appeals came roaring back in. And in Begin, Shamir, Sharon, Netanyahu, you see the dominance of ideas, not to say anything about Gush Emunim, that is the fundamentalist messianists. Had almost completely disappeared by 1967. There were only about a dozen students in their seminary. Then they became the largest non-parliamentary political movement in Israel. So the victory in the war destroyed the hegemonic position of ideas that had protected Israel from itself and from parts of Zionism that were no longer functional. Those have been released, and we're coping with the consequences today.
And tell us a little about how the Likud government, which embraced, if not totally, in substantial measure, this fundamentalist position, how they set about creating facts that, as you say, created interest.
Well, they didn't. What's ironic is that the Likud is the right wing of the Zionist movement, going back to the revisionists. They always used to make fun of the labor rights, the socialist Zionists, who would create facts during the mandate period. We want this part of Palestine to be within the Jewish state. Fine, we'll put up a stockade there. one more dunam, one more goat, one more acre of land, one more goat. That's how we're going to get the country. And Jabotinsky, that is the leader, the ancestor of Begin, the mentor of Begin, would say, this is absurd. This is not the way a respectable nation gets a state. Respectable nation gets a state by going out and conquering it and annexing it, or going to the British Empire and having them give it to us. So they made fun of this. But when the Likud came into power, it saw in the old labor Zionist techniques, which had been used in some settlements even earlier in the West Bank by the Labor Party governments, as the key. They didn't want to officially annex the West Bank and Gaza. That would mean giving citizenship to the Arabs there, and it would mean a confrontation with the world, to say nothing of the majority in Israel that still opposed it. But if they just one more settlement, one more settler, one more road, eventually the idea was to create a network, an infrastructure, a set of interests that would make it impossible politically for governments to give up that area, and then impossible psychologically to imagine you would give it up. That was their objective. And under Begin, under Shamir, that was their objective. Even though they pretended to negotiate, it was my job in the State Department and elsewhere to try to convince American diplomats that when they were negotiating with the Israelis and not objecting to settlement activity, they were actually following the Israeli game plan. Shamir put it best after he lost the 1992 election, when he admitted that the negotiations he had been involved in Madrid, he was going to drag on for 10 years, not with the hope of getting an agreement, but with the hope of putting 1 million Jews into the West Bank and Gaza and making future negotiations irrelevant.
Now, explain to us what have been the factors, the forces that prevent this reality and possibility becoming a reality.
What is the reason, in other words, why the vision of Gush Emunim, the Bloc of the Faithful, and Shamir Begin governments of making Jewish rule over the whole land of Israel are reality? First of all, Israel is not living in a vacuum. The world is a much more tightly interconnected place than it ever had been, and Israel has been deeply implicated and dependent on the United States. So when you try to convince people that we shouldn't even think about the West Bank, shouldn't even be on the agenda, and at the same time you have to defend yourself all the time against outsiders questioning, why are you doing that? The Palestinians want to talk to you. Why don't you negotiate with them? You undermine your ability not to think about it because you have to give rational arguments. In fact, a very amusing thing happened. Shamir was meeting secretly with the youth movement of the Herut party that he was the head of when he was prime minister. And he was asked, Mr. Prime Minister, this is in my Unsettled States book, Mr. Prime Minister, what do we do when we're asked by the leftists and by the Americans, why should Israel insist on having Judea and Samaria? Why not withdraw from the settlements for peace? What should we say to these people? So Shamir said, don't say anything to them. Don't argue with them. Just say, kachazeh. That's the way it is. And he's right. You see, because if you argue, that means that there's some rational basis, some contingent basis on which maybe things could change and you wouldn't need those territories. If you can't win by not arguing, then ultimately Israel won't win at all from the point of view of keeping them. And the other basic reason is because they were unwilling and unable to expel the Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza, or to make them demographically irrelevant. With all of the massive billions and billions of dollars put into subsidized Jewish settlement in the West Bank and Gaza, excluding the Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, Greater East Jerusalem, you have about 200,000 settlers in the West Bank and Gaza, 200,005, and something like maybe 250 at the most. But you've got 3 million Palestinians. So it's still not even up to what the French had in Algeria at the time when they were all evacuated.
So it's demography that's working against Israel, but also the mobilization of Palestinian nationalism.
Demography, of course, is the bottom. The mobilization of Palestinian nationalism, particularly in the Intifada. I actually thought that one reason why the left in Israel, and we also can't forget them, that there's Israelis who have noted from some of them from very early on, including generals and intellectuals, that this was a catastrophe. But they were running against the grain of a triumphalist culture after the 1967 war. It took painful Pyrrhic victories in 1973, a real defeat in Lebanon, then the brutal confrontation with the Palestinians during the Intifada to start to convince masses of Israelis that they couldn't just get what they wanted, that they actually had to actually give something to the Palestinians. What has become an issue. But that was a major accomplishment, let's not diminish it, of the Israelis themselves, that portion of them that were willing to analyze, willing to think, willing to act on behalf of a better future. So but Palestinian political opposition was weak. It was weak before the first Intifada. And there were many reasons for that, including very clever and divisive Israeli policies of occupation, and also policies of the PLO on the outside and of the regimes that did not want an alternative leadership in the West Bank and Gaza to arise to challenge it. It was kind of an implicit partnership, really, between the Israelis and the outsiders that kept the Palestinians in the territories from mobilizing. But in the first Intifada, that occurred. And
this would have been what year?
1988, 1987, the end of it, to 1993, which led to the Oslo negotiations.
What is the U.S. role in all of this? You've been in the government, you've thought about what our government does. Has our policy evolved appropriately as the circumstances have changed?
Our policy has not evolved appropriately. Our policy, in some sense, has stayed where, in a formal way, more or less where it's always been, which is not a bad place. That is, officially, we believe that there ought to be a solution based on Resolution 242, which seems to suggest almost complete Israeli withdrawal from the territories, except for mutually agreed changes. Now we're much more willing than we ever were before to express the sentiment that that ultimately will mean a Palestinian state. What we have not done is change the pattern of being active and then backing away from it. Active and engaged and then backing away from it. So we've done so many of those minuets where it looks like the United States is going to engage, then political forces in the United States emerge, or other international issues emerge which distract the attention of the elites, or an election comes up, or a new Israeli policy is implemented which provokes violence on the Arab side and destroys the context for the American initiative. Repeatedly, I have seen this movie dozens and dozens of times, and I'm seeing it again now. So although sometimes you will get an effective, discreet, short intervention, whether it was President Carter, First President Bush, it doesn't usually last long enough to actually help bring the parties to an agreement in the end. It's interesting that Oslo occurred not under American tutelage, but independent of that. So it's a matter of the United States not being able really to escape the logic of its own political system. And that logic requires countervailing force. So everybody in the United States is trained by Madison, by the Federalist Papers. We're all told, go out and get what you want ruthlessly, because everybody else is going to do that. And it's okay, because what will come out of that will be that the government won't be able to do too much. So it won't make lots of big mistakes. And only when everybody agrees, amazingly enough, will little something get done. But basically the idea is don't make big mistakes. That was Madison's, that's the Founding Fathers' message. And that's what we do. In foreign policy, when you get people into the government who are trained to think that way, if you can get it, go after it. In foreign policy, there's no countervailing force. There's no other lobby that pushes the other way. Mm-hmm. That makes it much more interesting for presidents to operate in foreign policy because they don't get pushed around as much. But it also means that if they use the same inclinations that drive them inside the country, they tend to make bigger mistakes and only learn about the consequences years later, as in Vietnam. Well, when you have, that usually doesn't matter that much because Americans don't care that much about foreign policy. But when you have one group in the country that cares a tremendous amount about one issue, like the Israel lobby in this country, then the government responds to that in what is an unproductive and irrational way. So it is not a coincidence that we can give $3 billion a year in aid to Israel for decades and say that it was because of the Cold War, and Israel was our asset, our strategic asset, a land-based aircraft carrier. $3 billion a year, and then the Cold War ends, completely disappears. What happens to the amount of aid? Absolutely nothing. So what was the rationale for it? It had nothing to do with the Cold War. The rationale had to do with a political representation of a political set of political interests. And U.S. government only escapes from that in times of severe crisis, when it feels it doesn't have anything to lose. It can stand up to the Israel lobby. It can, for example, during the Yom Kippur War, when Kissinger was told by Nixon, impose a comprehensive peace, negotiate between Jordan and Israel. And in his memoirs, Kissinger, because I'm twisting in the wind with Watergate, I don't need the Jews anymore. Anyway, in his memoirs, Kissinger says, he proudly says, I didn't follow this instruction because it would give the Soviets a victory diplomatically, which they didn't deserve. Not because he didn't think this would actually bring peace to Israelis and Palestinians. Now this kind of, in the Afghan war, we saw that right after 9/11, the Bush administration went into the mode which administrations go into when there's a real crisis and they need multilateral support, including in the Middle East, which is talk about Palestine, energize the U.S. policy, start talking about two-state solution, really indicate to the Israelis that they're going to have to finally play ball. As soon as the bombing of the Taliban seemed to destroy their ability to fight, the idea that we didn't need the Muslims and we weren't destabilizing Pakistan, things were going well, all of that rhetoric was set aside and we went back to the unilateralism and to cheerleading for the whatever government is in Israel, which is basically what Condoleezza Rice and company are doing now.
What about the Clinton proposals and that whole effort? Was it a serious departure from the formula you just described?
Clinton was more knowledgeable than anyone since Carter, but Carter's problem was that this Afghanistan and the Iranian hostage crisis completely distracted him from the Arab-Israeli.
That's the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Right, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And so that meant that very high-level attention was lost, and the Begin government was able to manipulate us because of that. Clinton became very engaged, but he also became infatuated with certain people in Israel, like Barak, and didn't understand how he was being played by them. And Clinton also uncharacteristically made serious tactical mistakes at Camp David, such that it played into the hands of those on the Palestinian side who argued that the United States was being Israel's lawyer. I mean, he literally went to the Palestinians and said, this is the American position, when the position he presented them was exactly the Israeli position that had been secretly transmitted to the Palestinians. So he decredibilized his own position. Now, it's not surprising at all that Camp David itself failed. This was just one attempt, but the first attempt to negotiate the really difficult issues. It would have been amazing if it had succeeded. But we know from the subsequent negotiations at Taba between Israel and the Palestinians, where the United States was not present, though there were European observers, that Barak abandoned many of the ultimatums he'd issued, and the Israelis and Palestinians came to a position that was, they say, within 2 to 3 months of an agreement. As a matter of fact, and here's where Clinton's lasting contribution lay. In January, he gave an important speech listing the parameters, what are called the Clinton parameters, what the deal is going to eventually be between the Israelis and Palestinians. These are the parameters of a deal which cognoscenti for quite a while, 10 years, had sort of known. But no, the United States government had never laid it out. And here he was laying it out, that this is what was called in political science the Schelling point, the focal point. This is where the obvious compromises are on all the issues, from Jerusalem to refugees to borders to settlements. And the Taba negotiations came out very close to those. And when negotiations start, they're going to inevitably return to the Clinton parameters.
Now, all of this failed, initially because of the Palestinian response, but then the change in government of Israel. And looking at what you have written, one gets the sense that this result could have been expected because of the stalemate in Israeli democracy, that the right was incapable imposing a fundamentalist view, but the left really was left with no alternative given the failure of the negotiations in Washington.
If we look at it more broadly, in the book that I wrote, Unsettled States, I tried to solve this question of had the point of no return been passed, and I feel that I did, by looking at it not in terms of one point of no return, whether either it's impossible or it's possible, but two thresholds. If you want to keep all the territories in Israel, you have to make the issue of what to do with them disappear. You have to establish what are called the hegemony of the idea of the greater land of Israel. That's impossible for reasons we've already discussed. So Israel can't go to the right of that threshold. But in order to get out, you have to risk a civil war in Israel. You have to risk the fact that groups, including the settlers and the right-wing parties, feel so strongly opposed to withdrawal that they will attack the government. They will try to assassinate the leadership. They will try to engineer a disobedience in the army in the large mass. They will resist violently. Somehow the government has to, and every time the government has tried to negotiate a peace, they've come up against that threat and they've drawn back. So Israel's kind of caught between the inability to make the issue disappear and the inability by making the West Bank look like Israel, and the inability to make it disappear by actually withdrawing, by getting through that regime barrier, that regime threshold. Someday, one of these days, that regime threshold is going to be crossed. I like to think of it as a kind of a gambler throwing dice, except it's history that's throwing the dice. Every throw of the dice is like a diplomatic peace process attempt. In order to actually succeed, history has got to throw snake eyes. Two. And you know, that's not easy. You have to keep throwing in dice. Eventually you're going to throw a two. All of the leadership questions and accidents of history, the passions of both sides, the torturous feelings of suffering, the political coalitions, the timing of elections will fall into place. But if you're on the other side, and you want the West Bank and Gaza to remain permanently under Israeli rule, you have to roll a 13. But you can't roll a 13, which is to say the right has no plan for how it can successfully keep the territories anymore. They don't even advocate as a realistic option expelling the Palestinians. So they have no plan. So if you are the right, and you know you have to roll a 13, the strategy is don't let the dice get rolled. Keep trying to stop every initiative and subvert it if it gets started. That's at a very sort of ugly tactical level. That's why every time Anthony Zinni, the U.S. representative of the peace process, gets sent to the Middle East, more Hamas leaders get assassinated by Israel, or there's an invasion of a refugee camp. The invasion of the refugee camps in Balata and Jenin, which we've been seeing recently, that caused so much violence, directly linked to the Saudi peace initiative to try to prick that bubble by shifting the political atmosphere around it into exploding violence. That's what you do. It's the only rational thing to do in order to prevent history from eventually producing what it will produce, which is a two-state solution.
Now, what sort of changes does there have to be in the United States with regard to Israel that would contribute to this process of snake eyes?
Well, there are two things. I mean, one is that the public discourse has to be enriched so that fewer people are afraid to criticize an Israeli government than they are. And what, people in the Israeli lobby have often said the U.S. media is prejudiced against Israel. They blow up every single little event, and they hardly criticize the Arabs. When I talk to people and distribute information, I never use reports in the American press, because the reports in the American press are too slantedly pro-Israel. I only use Israeli newspaper accounts, Jewish, Israeli, Hebrew accounts. If those were published in the United States and known, that's all the information you need. So that's one thing, is a discussion that would be formed by what Israelis are saying about the situation. The other thing is the people who get installed in the bureaucratically important positions in the Pentagon, in the CIA, in the State Department, in the National Security Council, they are drawn from a pool that is anxious to cover their future political careers. And that means steering clear of controversial positions on Arab-Israeli relations. And controversial in the United States means things that are not towing the Israel lobby line. And those two things have to change. They're related, obviously, but they both have to change.
So I'm reminded about what you said was your change of thinking back as an undergraduate, namely, or even before that, namely that somehow you have to come to the realization that what you think you know, you don't actually know, or it has to be thought of in a different way.
Yes. I mean, I think you're right. I don't think it's a coincidence, although I didn't know it at the time, that the motto of Brandeis University is truth, even unto its innermost parts, which is actually a traditional Jewish phrase, along with another phrase in Jewish tradition, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice pursue. Well, those two things are the themes that I try to follow, but I think I get some kind of satisfaction as an academic and as a person out of learning and teaching things that are surprising to people and maybe difficult for them to accept. And it's not that I enjoy the pain that they experience, but I found my world so much more interesting, so much more exciting, having gone through the process of understanding that I was only seeing a portion of it in a very distorted way before, and that afterward, thinking in a broader way, thinking in a way that always looks for patterns in universal, or at least general patterns, and not assuming that one piece of human experience is totally isolated from all the rest, that this is a liberating experience.
Does it take courage to be Jewish and be a demystifier of power when it's exercised in a Jewish state?
You know, I've been attacked a lot because of this. I feel that it's a terrible tragedy that Jews get attacked for saying, you know, I'm a self-hating Jew and so on, for saying things critical of the government in Israel. But if it is the case that a Palestinian or even any non-Jew saying something like this is attacked even more viciously as an anti-Semite, then Jews who know, more or less, who are knowledgeable, have a greater responsibility to speak out. They have no right to keep silent. But and people have said, boy, you know, you are a courageous person. Look at all, I don't feel that way. I feel I love studying this. I remember thinking, how come everybody isn't studying it? It's so fascinating. And I have been so I found so much satisfaction in being able to communicate intellectually with people about this, to engage their intellect, their critical faculties, showing them that what they deeply care about is best preserved by engaging those critical faculties and not choosing one issue and saying, I'm a brilliant lawyer, I'm a brilliant doctor, I'm a brilliant playwright, I'm a brilliant financier, but when it comes to Israel and the Middle East, I don't apply my intellectual faculties. That is not the way they succeed in any of those areas, and they won't succeed in protecting Israel that way. And I've had so much success in communicating and getting people to move a little bit beyond the way they're thinking, that I don't think of myself as courageous, only as lucky to have so many opportunities to engage in that way. And I also feel that way about the country. I mean, there's no one who was more, anti-war during the Vietnam War, and I certainly was disabused of many myths I had about the country. But here is someone who studied one particular issue, settlements in the occupied territories and how they would prevent peace, and I don't think that anyone had studied this more than I had. And in 1989, I was called by first President Bush to the White House for a closed discussion. What should we do about this? And for an hour and a half, I got to talk to the president and his top advisors, and helped, I think, to convince them to give the kind of speech that James Baker gave to AIPAC, which led to the loan guarantees suspension, which led to the victory of the Rabin government, I believe, Rabin over Shamir in the 1992 elections, and then led to Oslo. So I feel that the country has opened the door to someone who who wouldn't have much of a reason to believe could exercise that much influence. The idea that it may have taken some courage, again, that's not something that I feel particularly.
Now, one view of a social scientist is that you apply rationality, you publish your book, and then go on to the next book. But very clearly in what you're saying is a notion of advocacy and seeking to help affect change beyond just the writing of a book. And I'm curious about if you think what I just said is fair, and then how you, as a social scientist, reconcile this concern with looking at a problem like a scientist on the one hand, but on the other hand, drawing on these emotions and passion to actually try to change things.
Well, Gramsci said, you can't really have knowledge, disciplined science without passion. Nobody's going to sit at a bench for 14 hours a day studying unless he feels that there's a real driving purpose behind it. But I think in a lot of science can be twisted and distorted by that kind of passion. The key for me, as I said earlier, is to set up a problem that stands on its own. So when you start to communicate about it, you can't tell what the solution to this problem is going to mean for the issue at stake. And the value of the science is in solving that problem. It may very well happen that as a result of solving that problem, you look at the problem of interest, the political, in a totally different way. But the science has to stand on its own. And it's also the case that sometimes I've come to conclusions, for example, in the early 1990s, that Jerusalem not only should be separated from Al-Quds. There's the Israeli idea of a united Yerushalayim that's so large and expanded is not permanent, that this should be divided. And I first present, and what I wrote on that became quite influential in the Camp David and Taba negotiations, and it is basically now what the solution is going to be. But at the time, I was critiqued by the left, by the moderates for saying that. Even though I'd come to the school, I shouldn't publish it. Mm-hmm. Why? Because the right would be able to use the idea that the left was eventually going to divide Jerusalem in order to defeat them in the election. But I'd come to this conclusion as a social scientist, and I was not going to delay publication because of that. It's also the case that my book, Unsettled States, Disputed Lands, which leads to certain, as I said, advice about how a government can get out of the territories. It was reviewed in the Settler Journal, Nikuda, that is the Gush Emunim Journal, extensively. And they studied it, and they learned from it how to stop that process, how the settlers in Ulster were so much more successful in the way they blocked British attempts to get out of all of Ireland than the French settlers in Algeria had been. And the argument of the reviewer was, and we must learn from this and therefore do this and not that, and they did it. Mm-hmm. So the point is that when you are doing good science, driven by whatever passion, if it's good science, it's actually available to both sides.
So if students were to watch this tape, and what does the story of Ian Lustick's intellectual journey tell them about what they should study on the one hand, and on the other hand, how they shouldn't lose their passion for what they really care about?
Well, I think one of the things I would say to students is that a lot of what's most important that's going on is not necessarily in the classroom, but in arguments and engagements that occur to you that are unsettling. You may not notice at the time that they've been unsettling, but try to keep some part of your mind focused on how you're reacting to things that were really surprising, contradictory to what you'd always thought. Follow that. Work with it. Another thing I found is that it's what my parents told me, that the main thing about your work is you should love it. And if you really love it, there's plenty of talent around. There really is plenty of talent around. And if you love something, chances are you're going to have talent in that area. The real difficulty is to find people ready to combine talent, commitment, and a personality which is capable of engaging with others in a way that shares appropriately. That's the problem, is combining talent with a vehicle, a personal vehicle to carry it forward. And so that is just go with what you love, and go with everything you've got after what you love.
Ian, thank you very much for spending this time with us today, coming back to Berkeley and telling us about your intellectual odyssey.
It's been my privilege. Thank you, Harry.
Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.